What is the creepiest and most unexplainable paranormal experience you've ever had? Not creepy but kind of cool. My mother split and transplanted a rosebush from my grandfather's farm about 40 years ago. It took but never bloomed. At that point she only kept it because it grew into the fence nicely and kept us kids from climbing it. My grandfather died about 5 years after she transplanted it, and that spring it bloomed red roses. A few years after that my grandmother died, and the spring after it bloomed white roses. These are the only 2 years it has ever bloomed. My mother's favorite animal was the hummingbird. Last year, shortly after she passed away, a hummingbird came right up and looked at me as I was on my way to my car to go to work, like a foot away, and just checked me out for a while and flew off to do hummingbird things. Once I got to my car, I broke down. Just sat there in the driver's seat and cried. I'd like to think my mom was somehow checking up on me. I know it's silly, but for that moment I felt like she wasn't gone and she was still there watching over me. When I was around 12, my mother had to go out of town for a bit and she left me home alone for a few days. We lived close to relatives, so it wasn't a big deal back then. She refused to give me a mobile phone because she figured she could just call me on the landline if anything came up. She told me the date when she'd be back, and that was that. The date arrives and I hear my mom knocking on the door downstairs, calling my name. My dog, who loved her, got excited when she heard her voice and ran down ahead to greet her. She got to the door, freaked the hell out, and ran back upstairs to me. I refused to go down and opened the door. The phone started ringing and the knocking stopped. I picked up the phone to hear my mom say, "Hey, I'm sorry, I have to stay one more day here. I'll head home tomorrow." TL. Doctor, someone thing pretended to be my mom. Didn't fool the dog. Edit. Syntax. I was a rookie cop when my brother committed suicide. He was one of my older siblings, but we were very close. He died in another state, and I had a lot of guilt then about not recognizing the signs. His remains were in bad shape by the time he was discovered, so it was a closed coffin service. About a week after he died, I was back at work one night, and my partner and I see a pimp pistol whipping one of his girls. I jump out, and the pimp sees me, and the foot chase was on. I was running after him, gun in hand, and he cuts through a narrow corridor under a building that leads to a courtyard in the middle. Right before I reach the courtyard, I hear "It's okay" in my dead brother's voice. I hit the courtyard and the guy is against the side pointing a gun at my head and squeezes the trigger twice. I froze for a millisecond and then started beating him in the head with my revolver. Till this day, I don't know why I didn't just shoot him, cuff him and walk him back to the street and find my partner. I tell my partner about him squeezing the trigger, but not the voice I heard. We unload the gun. 32 revolver, right there, and 2 bullets have strike marks on them. Take the gun to the lab for testing. Tell the tech the story. He puts the 2 bullets with strike marks back in and shoots into the test tank. Both bullets fired. We used to live in a battered women's and children's shelter when I was young because my father was looking for us. Ugly divorce. Alabama gave him custody. Mom took us to WA. One night, I looked in the mirror and saw a hairy demon looking back at me. I screamed and cried and ran to get my mom, who assured me it was a normal mirror. But that night, a kind looking man that I can only describe as a ghost appeared at the end of my bed. He was there all night, but gone when I woke up in the morning. Then, the next night, and the next night. He was there every night for 4 months. We never talked, he never moved, just stood guard. Then, one night he woke me up from my sleep, and I'll never forget how surprised I was, because I'd never seen him move or talk. He said, "He's coming. Get out now." So we packed up the car and left to a hotel for the night. The next morning, we went back to find out someone had broken in and gone room to room looking for someone. I never saw him again after that. When I was growing up, I was tight with the daughter of my dad's cousin. So my second cousin, I suppose. Her name was Lisa. We grew much closer as teenagers. Too close really. Anyway, we wised up a little and went our separate ways when it was time for college. A few years passed and I had moved on. One night I got up to take a piss, didn't bother to turn on the lights. I was washing my hands and glanced in the mirror. There she was. Lisa was standing in the doorway behind me. I heard the echo of her voice. She told me that she still loved me and always would. She then turned and walked out of sight. I stood holding onto the sink for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I calmed myself down and decided it had just been a dream. I tried to go back to bed. My pillow smelled like her. She could have been in the room seconds ago. I lay back down, and as I drifted off to sleep I felt her warm familiar presence against my back. The next morning there was no sign of her. No scent, no indent in the covers. I wrote it off as a dream. I got a call from my mom later that day. She told me Lisa had died a few days earlier. She had been killed by her boyfriend. He got drunk and angry, and he hit her, and that was that. I guess she stopped by to see me one last time, to say goodbye before she moved on. Here's to you, Lisa. 20 years later, and you're still the only woman I ever truly loved. As a 4-year-old, I fucking hated tying my shoes. I was terrible at it, and progress was just not happening. One morning I was throwing a sheet fit because my mom told me to tie my shoes before we left the house, and I was trying to avoid this horrible responsibility while crying and screaming on the 3rd or 4th step of the staircase. The ceiling above the staircase extended from the 2nd floor horizontally to the space above the 1st step, where it met a vertical wall that connected the 2nd floor ceiling to that of the 1st. Imagine a big upside down L. So my punkus is screaming on one of the lower steps, and my gaze drifts upwards after a few minutes. I stop crying immediately, and I go silent. I distinctly remember seeing a man in a sharp black suit with the head of a boar, only blue and complete with tusks and fur, bracing himself in the corner of the ceiling, like a ninja, above my head staring down at me. He didn't say anything to me, but I know what he wanted. My mom began to ask me what happened, noticing my abrupt change in mood, and I cut her off in a monotone, saying only he told me to be good. Apostrophe. I lived in a haunted apartment. It was 2 rooms, but one of the rooms was locked, and I didn't have the key. So I only had one small room as kitchen, dining room and bedroom, and a screened-in porch. There were 2 especially freaky events. One night, my girlfriend slept over, and she woke up in the middle of the night and said she saw the bathroom door open and a shadowy figure standing in the bathroom, staring at her. The bathroom was right across from the locked room. Another time, I was jerked awake by the fire alarm going off, just blaring. But when I went to unplug it, the alarm stopped, and no other alarm in the building was going off. A lot of the things that happened could have been just my neighbors, but the way they happened was, well, weird. I would hear knocking. It sounded like someone tapping a spoon on a counter, coming from the downstairs apartment. It could have been my neighbor, but I'm not sure why she would do that every couple of minutes for hours on end, or in the middle of the night. I would also hear knocking on the walls. It sounded like someone tapping their way up the wall, like they were looking for a stud. I would also hear this weird moaning howling that I couldn't trace the source of. Again, could have been a neighbor's dog, but it didn't sound like it was coming from her apartment. The apartment across from me had 3 tenants in a year, I think because it was just as or more haunted than mine. I had, I think, a unique way of coping. I named the ghost Pete after a previous tenant's mail I would get from time to time, and I tried talking to him, basically treating him like a roommate I wasn't friends with. My girlfriend was much more freaked out by the situation than me, and basically stopped coming over after a few months, so I wasn't there much anyway. When I felt that talking to Pete made the atmosphere of the whole place much more friendly. I also left out a sheet of paper with Pete's notes written on it, and told him, if he had any problems, just write them down. I still don't know if I quite believe in ghosts, though I find the supernatural fascinating, but that experience did push me closer to the science. Doesn't know everything about the universe camp. Growing up, my older brother had a computer program that he used to compose piano music on. I remember I was reading in the living room when I heard the most beautiful violin melody I have ever heard. I listened to the whole thing, which was several minutes long. I walked down the hallway to compliment my brother on his masterpiece when I realized my brother was not using the computer and I was home alone. Just told this story to a coworker, was around 7 years old, and it was near the holidays. The house I grew up in has a downstairs and a basement. So I left my pillow downstairs after a day-long movie binge and went to grab it later that evening. Grab the pillow and look up, see a man on the other side of the room dressed to the nines just looking around paying no attention to me. Weird thing was he was entirely grey. Head to toe, skin color and everything, grey. I'm staring, jaw wide open, completely petrified with fright. He looks up at me, notices I'm able to see him, and drops his jaw lower than humanly normal, almost as if he was screaming at me, but without sound. He then ran through the wall and disappeared. I wasn't able to go downstairs, if the lights were off, until I was a teenager. This happened when I was 17. When I was still living at my childhood home, I was sneaking out late at night to meet some friends. I went through the back door of the house, and as I turned to face the door I could just feel somebody watching me. I thought I was busted. I turned to look at who had caught me, and saw a totally monochrome figure. The hair was completely black, like blacker than black. Her face was like a static washed over white grey, and she was wearing a dress that was in between the two colors. No facial features, just the silhouette of a young girl facing me. I reached for the door as fast as I could, and when I went to shut it, it closed very quickly on me. I bolted through my yard and onto the street, and couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. I stayed at my friend's that night. Soon after this happened, I was up late with my mom watching a movie. My dad had just passed away. We finish our movie up and say goodnight after turning the TV, stereo receiver, and DVD player, all with their own remotes. After a short amount of time in bed, I'm jarred awake by the sound of static with the speakers cranked up and the TV on with no input. My mom and I meet in the hallway, surprised to see that we had both been awoken to an empty house. A few years ago, when I was 23-ish and graduated from college, I finally told my family about the first occurrence. Before I'm able to finish my description of the ghost, she finishes for me, telling me that her and her friend used to see a little girl in our backyard playing in a sundress. She said that she looked maybe 12. Our neighbor, who was the original owner, shared a story with us about the family that originally bought the house after it was built. It was a young family whose daughter passed away from leukemia. She would have been about the right age. Looking back, the girl wasn't scary or harmful. My sister had the same impression. To this day I believe what we saw and haven't seen anything like it ever since. Edit. I also want to say that my dog used to scare the crap out of me because he would randomly stare down the hallway to my sister's room and he would growl with his hair on end. It would always freak me out, and I never connected the two until sometime after seeing the ghost or whatever it may have been. Mine is secondhand. My stepmom and my dad used to work opposite shifts there for a while. He was on nights, her on days. They had a set of baby monitors from when my sister and I were babies. My dad said they could record short messages with them, and they would leave them out on the coffee table for the other to hear when they got home from their shift. This went on for a bit, then once their shifts lined up they'd put the monitors away in storage. She died of cancer at a really young age, and my dad had just gotten back from the funeral and was home alone. He spent that night going through their things, packing some of her stuff away. He said he had one of the baby monitors sitting out on the coffee table, and it woke him up in the middle of the night with an old message going off on repeat that she had recorded. It said, "I love you, Mike. I love you, Mike," over and over. My dad told me he just sat on the couch in the dark and listened to her message until the batteries died. A couple of weeks later he had picked us kids up for the weekend. After my sister and I went inside, he said he was sitting on the porch smoking, and a strong gust of wind blew, and he said he could smell her perfume that she always wore. It scared me hearing those stories as a kid, but now I can see the beauty and peace in those experiences. This didn't happen to me, but it happened to my dad. We used to live in a home that was part of the Underground Railroad. It had a few hidden crawl spaces around the house that was being used as storage in the present. While we lived there, my brother started sleepwalking and talking. One night while my parents were sleeping, they heard my little brother scream from my bedroom, even though he slept downstairs. My dad ran up there, but my bedroom door was closed like something was blocking it, so he kicked the door up. But when he kicked it open, A shadow ran past him, and my room was ice cold. My brother was laying on my bed, sound asleep, pointing at the closet screaming, "Get her, daddy, get her." My dad looked, but saw nothing but darkness, quickly picked up my brother, who was stiff as a board, covered in sweat, and ran out. When my brother finally woke up that morning, he remembered nothing that happened. After we moved out, he stopped sleepwalking. When I was a young teenager, my father and my stepmother had gotten married. This forced me and my little brother to move into her home and share the same bedroom for quite some time. 3 weeks before we moved in, my stepmother's mom had died, where I slept for most of my childhood. The spooky part happens one night when I got off of my computer and I was going to bed. I had laid there for maybe 10 minutes when I started hearing scratching at my closet door. I figured it was a mouse and went to sleep. I go to get dressed in the morning and open my closet door to see very long scratches down the inside of the door. Like deep scratches. It wasn't in one area, it was wavy from the top of the door to the bottom. Both hands. 10 lines. That's the scariest thing that's ever happened to me.